welcome back. As you can see, I haven't had a haircut for a while, so it just looks like this. It's going to look like this for a while. Now, it might sound a bit confusing to make a video about what happens when you let your family history research distract you, but sometimes, believe it or not, a bit of curiosity is not a bad thing, and it can lead you to all sorts of unexpected details. So I thought actually I would make this video as a little example. I've given quite a few talks about interesting things that I've found in my research and in things that have inspired me, discoveries I've made. Originally it was going to be just a few pretty scenic shots of Retford Cemetery, because that's where my granddad is buried and his parents are buried and his mother's parents are buried, but I thought actually it would be more interesting if I combined it with what I discovered about Retford Cemetery, because it turns out that my family has got a link to it. Why not bring the two together? You could call it applied family history, I suppose. Now, my granddad was the son of William Siggs and Maria Ann Barnett, and when we first began researching, we didn't know anything about Maria. We didn't know what part of the country she came from. We only knew that she lived in Retford. We guessed maybe she was born there, but that was about it. And there were actually quite a lot of Maria Barnetts who could have been Grandad's mum, but eventually we managed to narrow it down and find the one likely birth certificate that we thought looked like her. Unfortunately it was. So here is our first clue, and this finally showed me that her father George was a groom. This I hadn't known, and at the time they were living at Tinsley Park near Sheffield. So that's one part of the puzzle solved. And then we've got the critical element, the marriage certificate, which shows quite clearly that Maria is again the daughter of George Barnett, the cemetery keeper, living at West Retford. So this is pretty definitely the same woman. In 2017, we went back to Retford to explore in the cemetery, and with a bit of help from the local council, because it's not a churchyard kind of cemetery, it's one of those great big municipal enormous cemeteries with thousands and thousands of graves, so we were never going to find anything just by having a wander about. Now obviously you can take your family history research beyond things like censuses, birth, marriage and death certificates, baptism records and all that kind of thing, and that's what I wanted to do in Maria's case. And more to the point, what can we find out about her dad, George, because he's got an official kind of job. He's the cemetery keeper, we've seen that. So there are a few options. Your census records, newspapers, trade directories are very good. According to the 1881 census, George and the family actually lived on London Road in Ortsall, which is just outside Retford, and he was a coachman, a domestic coachman, but by 1891 he was at Cemetery Lodge, which, you guessed it, is the lodge attached to the cemetery, on Cemetery Road, as it was then called, and now he is the keeper, the groundskeeper of Retford's cemetery. So this sort of narrows the time frame down. We know that at some point between 1881 and 1891 the family have moved to that area, and therefore I knew George had to have been appointed as cemetery keeper at some point in that decade. I went browsing on the British Newspaper Archives website just to see what I could find, and because at the moment obviously the trip over there is just not possible, and I found something really interesting. Now, my great-grandma Maria was only about 7 years old. Her 7th birthday was 2.5 weeks after that newspaper was published, so I'm almost certain that she must have lived at the cemetery lodge, and I'm supposing that she probably went to a nearby school as well. So that's given me a little bit of an idea about great-grandma's life. That's an unexpected bonus. Now, the 1911 census, George was still alive then. At that point he's sort of 61 years old. He and his wife Marianne and 2 of their children are still living at Cemetery Lodge. He is still the cemetery keeper there. And the great thing about the 1911 census is that it does give you a few extra details about the property. And so from that we just know that they had a 5-room house, which seems quite good really for a cemetery keeper. It's a bit of a perk of the job. But there was at least one more useful resource that could tell me something about George and his life in Retford. Because last time I went to Retford, I managed to get a couple of hours in the local library, and that was where I found a copy of Kelly's Directory of Nottinghamshire for 1912, so it's quite handy. It was just the year after the census, so what's that going to tell me? I love trade directories. I always think they're like the yellow pages, but somehow more fun because they're historical, and obviously they don't often have phone numbers in the late Victorian period, although occasionally you might get 1 or 2. You can find everything in there. You can find the names of the town councillors, you can find out who the teachers were at different schools, how many schools there were, all the different places of worship, and the ministers, priests, vicars, whoever were attached to those parishes, shopkeepers, all those kind of interesting little things that really bring a town to life, I think. And quite often you get a little, sometimes not so little, paragraph or so about local history, and maybe even something about how the place got its name. So that just makes it all the more interesting, I think. A quote now from Kelly's Directory of Nottinghamshire concerning the pages about Retford, page 643, because they were huge, thick, great, you'd use them as a doorstop, and sometimes you actually get 2 volumes of these things. They are enormous. It says that it was a cemetery of 5 acres, 2 rods and 24 perches, old measure, on the Great North Road, was formed in 1854 at a cost of about £1,800. It contains 1 mortuary chapel, and it is under the control of a burial board of 6 members, chosen from the East Retford Corporation. The cemetery, although locally in this parish, is generally known as East Retford Cemetery. George Barnett had been born in 1850, so the cemetery had been around since his childhood. And because he had an official role there, he was even mentioned by name in the directory. You get some kind of an idea of not just the size and history of George's place of work, but also maybe just a little clue about some of the people that he might have known through his work, as well as William Percival Jones, the burial board clerk. He probably knew quite a few other people on the local council, I imagine. Here's an interesting thought for you. When tracing family history, a lot of us want to know whether somehow, by some miracle, our ancestor might have left a fortune that should really somehow have trickled down to us. It's rare that you find these things. I've yet to come across one in my tree, but you never know. And one really obvious way to do this is to find out whether they left a will. Now, I can only speak from experience of ordering English, and I've never ordered a Welsh will, but they are clubbed together in the same indexes. I haven't actually ordered George's will yet. It's something I really must get around to at some point, because I really would like to know a little bit more about him. But using the online probate search website, which is free to view and free to search, you've just got to go through page by page, I have searched the indexes and I have found a reference to him, so I know that there is a record of probate of his estate. Not everybody is listed on the probate calendar. Sometimes people sorted out their last effects privately. Sometimes people just didn't have anything to leave. In George's case, he actually did, which is great. The indexes are organised by year, and luckily George's effects were sorted out just a few weeks after he died in 1917. So this map from 1886 shows you the beginnings of the cemetery, the mortuary chapel and the canal going there along the edge of it. And then if you actually compare that to the 1897 map, you can see that the cemetery has suddenly got quite a lot bigger. There is a second section and clearly plans for a third. And then by 1916 you've got what is essentially the same map here. But the difference here is actually that the lodge, if you look very closely, the cemetery lodge is now listed on the map. So as you can see with family history, although this isn't a really in-depth video, there are lots of things I could probably look into that I haven't had a chance to look into about George Barnett and his life. It's really easy to go off on a tangent when you're researching, but sometimes that makes it all the more fascinating. It just brings your ancestors to life a little bit more. And there are all sorts of ways you can do this, all sorts of resources depending on the thing that you're looking for. You might not find very much, you might find one resource is far more useful than another resource. It just depends again what you're looking for. But even just a tiny piece of information can tell you a little something and help you to add a detail to the timeline of your ancestor's life. Because when you think about it, a census record is merely one snapshot, one day of somebody's life in a whole 10-year period. Isn't that a great reason to try to find out what people were doing on the other 3,500 days in that decade before the next census was going to come along? Because you can find all sorts of interesting information out there. And I hope that this will maybe inspire you to do so. Please tell me if it does.